I hope that you have all prepared some questions and that you will be enjoying today's discussion. It is a great honor because Dr. Egerton is our first international lecturer. Dr. Egerton, thank you very much once again for coming to us, for taking our invitation. For all our participants, today's lecture and questions and debate will be held in English. We used to record our sessions for the students that aren't able to participate at the Zoom meetings. So if you agree, Dr. Egerton, with that, I will give you the floor. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Sonia. I hope everybody can hear me. It's a very nice and great pleasure to join you this evening to give you some information about United Nations and what we're doing on extreme weather and climate, and also some risk and crisis management. I hope you'll find it very useful for your course. So I only speak a tiny bit of Serbian, but dobro veče, and I hope doviđenja, sorry, doviđenja. So I think I can speak a couple of words only, so I hope you will speak to me in English later on. What I'd like to do is just to, Sonia's introduced me, just to give you some presentation by PowerPoint. So I'll ask Professor to share the screen. So I'll just give me a second. And if you could just tell me, Sonia, whether you can see the screen okay.
I can see the screen.
Okay, perfect. So thank you. So I'd like to talk about this extreme weather, climate and security and crisis management at the United Nations. And the World Meteorological Organization, with a focus on that, is a specialized agency of the UN that covers climate, weather and water issues. And we're very much involved in climate change discussions and also climate security discussions at United Nations headquarters. And I'll try to give you just a few elements at the beginning of the risk landscape that we have. And the first slide that you'll see here is of the UN Secretary General Guterres on the front cover of Time magazine. And this is not a fake picture, it's actually a real one. That when he visited Tuvalu, he waded into the water in his suit to make a point that sea level is rising around the world, especially impacting on small island developing states, such as Tuvalu and also islands like Fiji and others. And this really poses a security risk and impact on the population, both in terms of deaths and also socioeconomic impacts as well. And we see lots of extreme weather events, which when we look at sea level rise and the impact of hurricanes and cyclones, there is a significant billions of dollars of damage that occurs every year and quite great loss of life also. So climate action is one of the UN Secretary General's top priorities and global diplomatic and political priority. And we've been helping him to really share the message globally with my Secretary General also in this. This is a picture of the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report Register from 2021. And you can see on the top right-hand side of the screen that the top risks globally that have been identified one is infectious diseases, which is not unusual in these COVID times. Climate action failure is one high likelihood and high impact. And then you can see down here extreme weather and human environmental damage. So over the last maybe 3 or 4 years, the World Economic Forum has emphasized that climate issues and extreme weather have been at the top of the global risk landscape. You can see things like weapons of mass destruction on the left-hand side here, which is again of low likelihood but high impact. And so these issues are very important on the global political agenda. And in fact, there's more and more discussion now in forums like the Security Council about how climate and extreme weather are instability in countries, especially in least developed countries where you have quite a lot of migration and you have a combination or nexus effect of climate change, of migration, and also terrorism as well, for example, states in Africa. Also, the other top issue is COVID-19, obviously, and everybody's now experiencing COVID-19. And the Secretary General made a statement in the last report that he issued on the Sustainable Development Goals that, in fact, at the beginning of June of 2020, this death toll had reached about 400,000 and was continuing to climb. And we've seen that this has been significant. And at that time, more than about 1.6 billion students were out of school, and tens of millions of people were pushed back into poverty. And this is also causing significant instability. And we see the impacts of COVID and also of climate change together having a significant impact on development in countries around the world. And so this also exposes things like the inequalities and injustices also that are occurring. So we see a combination of crises which actually are compounding each other. The Global Risk Network, also the World Economic Forum, this is a very complicated diagram, but it shows you on the outer arc the drivers, and on the inner arc the main risks. And you can see some of the drivers on the right-hand side related to extreme weather, climate action failure again. If you follow the green, you can see how interconnected these risks are. But essentially, these elements are coming out as being extremely important drivers. And you can see that in green, the environmental drivers are quite dominant, together with the economic elements as well. And we're starting to see more and more of both technological and societal issues as drivers. And I'll come to the more on the data and the digital part just towards the end of the presentation, what the UN is doing on the UN data strategy and how that can be used for decision-making also during crisis management. So I just want to say something a bit about WMO as a UN agency. And this is our headquarters in Geneva. I'm sat in this building at the moment, and it's one of the UN specialized agencies established around 1946, but we go back till about 1896 during the International Meteorological Organization. So we're responsible for global weather, climate, and water information. And we have all of our members around the world have both geostationary and polar orbiting satellites that are measuring the weather, the cloud patterns around the world, automatic weather stations on the ground, and also observations in the oceans and on land. And so we coordinate this on a kind of 24/7 basis, all of this information. And this information is open exchange of global data. It's also free and open to all countries. And we also focus on things like monitoring greenhouse gases, air quality, and also things like the polar regions, the cryosphere. So we have a global network of observations that we coordinate, and this is very useful when we want to inform decision makers about policy issues and having the best possible science and authoritative data available. Sorry. This is a picture of the key climate indicators that we have at the moment. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but on the left-hand side, the temperature curve you can see here has been rising since the pre-industrial period. So from 1850s up to present day in 2021, we've seen a rise of about 1.2 degrees centigrade above, or Celsius above, the pre-industrial average, which means before there was industrialization. And we've seen this growing at quite a rapid rate in recent years. And if you've seen the film with Al Gore, you know this, this temperature curve, that it's really accelerated during the last, from 1975 upwards to 2021. And we expect to see something like 1.3 degrees during the next year. The Paris Agreement, the target that they reached after the Paris climate deal a few years ago now, in fact 5 years ago, was talking about a range of 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees, And if we don't sustain it at that level, then there would be extreme and severe economic damage around the world. And it's kind of past a tipping point. So we really now have to have some political action to maintain temperatures at a level which we can manage. But that requires a lot of mitigation actions of countries to become carbon neutral. We also see carbon dioxide rising in the atmosphere, and it was around 410 parts per million last year, and we expect to see something like 411 or 412 parts per million this year. And you can see again the curve, every curve is actually rising on this. We're seeing extreme warm temperatures in the northern hemisphere in the Arctic. And you can see the red plume over parts of Russia. And sudden cooling in places around the world, but generally this warming during the summertime and also extreme cold during the winter. And this means that there is an effect on the circulation. We've published several reports on the state of the climate for WMO. And we publish an annual report called The State of the Climate and United in Science. And we've done this in collaboration with the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, in several press conferences. And I'll show you this in a moment, the information that we provide. During COVID, the climate change has not stopped. And so you may have seen some areas of the world where there's been a temporary reduction in greenhouse gases. So for example, in parts of Beijing around China, there's been less pollution because less cars are in there during the COVID lockdowns, but this has been only a very temporary reduction. So we saw something like a 6% reduction during the COVID lockdown, but in fact, the greenhouse gas concentrations globally are still rising. And so we're not on really a target to meet the temperature and greenhouse gas goals under the Paris Agreement. And so my Secretary General has basically made the statement that climate change has not stopped for COVID-19 and is continuing quite rapidly. Coming on to disasters now and kind of disaster management and crisis management. This is a graphic which shows you the relevant natural loss events worldwide during the period of 1980 through 2018. And the thing that I'd like you to focus on here is, first of all, in green, where we see the impact of Atlantic hurricanes impacting the US and the Caribbean area. We also see on the right-hand side across towards China, green, which is focusing on, again, cyclones and typhoons, which are storm events hitting China and the Southeast Asia. And we start to see also a lot more in the Madagascar area and impacting on Africa, also east coast of Africa. This is a multi-hazard map, so it also shows things like flood events, heat waves, which are becoming more persistent in East Africa and parts of also West Africa and Australia. And we see geological hazards as well, earthquakes and tsunamis, which are not very predictable. So we're focusing more on the extreme weather and climate and the way that that also impacts on societies and the way that we would provide early warning information to the public on these disasters. Water stress is also an issue, and we have what's called SDG 6, which is a Sustainable Development Goal 6, which is focused on water. And you can see basically on this map that there is extreme high water stress in the Sahara and parts of Northern Africa, Central Asia, and parts of South Africa and Australia. And this water stress is exacerbating the situation where we have also weak security situation. So in parts of the world like Yemen and you can see parts of the Middle East where there's extreme water stress, and this also causes migration of population and then becomes also a security issue, as we see on the ground that there are also human factors taking place as well. So the Security Council has discussed this on about a couple of occasions, the impact of water and climate on security challenges, especially in East Africa. And I was present for one of those meetings in the Security Council where we discussed and put forward information from WMO on this issue. We've developed a consortium of UN partners here, and you can see at the bottom the different UN agencies that are involved in this climate and water coalition, and organizations like UNDP, Food and Agricultural Organization, and UNEP, and others. And we've been engaging heads of state in this initiative, including the President of Hungary, the President of Tajikistan, and several other countries around the world that we see a challenge where there are water issues. The other thing is about early warning, and as an organization that runs infrastructure, we are interested in making sure that we have the right observations for early warning and to inform the population. And we've done a survey, and in fact, most of our member states, about 49% of the LDCs, don't have a multi-hazard early warning system in place. And about 66% of our national meteorological services don't have they have an established ERR governance mechanism, but around, you know, it's quite still quite worrying how many countries do not have established early warning systems. And we try to collect this data across the different regions of WMO. And you can see beneath here that region 3, for example, is the Africa region, and region 6 is Europe. So Europe has, I think, quite an advanced early warning systems in place. Even in Southeastern Europe, where we have what we call the Southeastern Europe Multi-Hazard Early Warning System, which the European Commission are also using. But in countries that are least developed countries or small island states, we don't have that infrastructure in place, and we need to invest in further observations. Onto crisis management, and you may have heard that the European Commission have an emergency response and humanitarian system, a crisis management system. And they have a center which is called the ERCC, European Emergency Response Coordination Center. And this enables weather and climate information and other factors to be fused together to provide what we call situational awareness and situational analysis. On the basis of that, then the European Commission can then mobilize its humanitarian effort in the region through its various services. And this is run by the DG ECHO, Directorate General ECHO, which we recently met with the commissioner, who's Commissioner Lenacek from Slovenia. Now, the EU has this response center, but we also have something at UN headquarters, and this is showing you just a picture of, on the left-hand side of the headquarters building in New York that I was working in for about 8 years. And on the right-hand side, this is a press conference. You can just see me right at the back, right at the end, stood next to the UN Secretary General making a statement about the climate change. And we do these press conferences quite regularly, and he uses our information to the press on a whole range of climate indicators, and we do this on a regular basis throughout the year. You can see here the United Nations also has a crisis center, and it's called UNOCC. And the top picture that you see here is of a meeting that was taking place with the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs and several peacekeeping officers and senior staff of the UN. And they have, this is in the briefing room where they have a situation awareness screen, which they can then connect globally to different UN missions around the world and brief on certain aspects. So if it's in relation to peacekeeping or if it's in relation to a situation. This is the director of the UNOCC that is speaking at the time. Underneath, you'll see a couple of pictures of what we call the watch center or the watch room. And this is where information is coming in on a minute-by-minute basis from around the world, and it's a 24/7 situational center. And we have a member of staff that's embedded into that center, and you can see the lady here on the left-hand side, Laura Patterson, who has been working embedded into the UN Crisis Center. And she monitors extreme weather events and climate issues, and then briefs the UN leadership on this, and their issue reports across the UN system. So we're trying to develop a capacity to monitor around the world and to give leaders in the UN early warning about these issues, so they can take action on the ground. And this is a fusion center, so it means we're fusing lots of different information together. And we're increasingly looking also at not just the awareness part of it, but the situational analysis. So especially through now artificial intelligence and data mining. This gives you an idea of what we do in terms of diplomacy on climate action. I'll just show you a few pictures of some of the initiatives. This is me with my Secretary General at a press conference, and we have these press conferences quite regularly. This is with the President of the General Assembly, and you can see here, for example, that we've talking about the 4 warmest years on record, and this was a tweet back in I think 2019. And the next one that we'll have of these is on the 19th of April, just in front of the US Climate Summit that's hosted by President Biden. And the US Climate Summit will take place on Earth Day. And at that meeting, he'll convene many heads of state to discuss about climate action in advance of the COP26 meeting in Glasgow. We're going to publish a major report on the 19th that will identify the state of the climate around the world and the state of disasters. And we'll do that in a live press conference again with UN Secretary General Guterres. We've also been meeting with other world leaders, and this is John Kerry that we met in Madrid to talk about the report that we were launching. And we are currently in touch with John Kerry, who's now the Special Presidential Envoy in Climate for the US administration. And he will be preparing the Biden Climate Summit on the 22nd of April. And hopefully the US will be fully engaged in the climate change negotiations in Glasgow, which are due to be in November of this year. We don't know yet whether it will be virtual or a physical meeting. I mentioned about the Security Council, and this is what it looks like around the table at the Security Council. And this was an opportunity for the World Meteorological Organization to present its results to the members of the Security Council in New York. And this was a special meeting on the impacts of climate change on security. And we had a lot of very good feedback. They don't discuss a lot at the Security Council this issue, but they've started in recent years during the different presidencies to bring this up. And most recently, the UK presidency convened a meeting to discuss the security impacts of climate change. Normally, it's something like a hard security issues. It could be nuclear proliferation, it could be terrorism, but we're increasingly starting to see these issues of water and climate coming up around the table there, and it's very important to be able to, for UN agencies to be able to give key information on this. I was just sat behind the main speaker when we took this picture. The other part is the COP26, and in Glasgow, we have the new COP26. This was last year in Madrid, or during 2019, the year before last now. And this was actually supposed to be hosted in Chile, and because of some problems in Chile, the Chilean government decided they wanted to have a partnership with Spain. And so, in fact, Madrid hosted this meeting. And this is my Secretary General addressing the plenary of the ministerial segment. And I was sat behind also the platform on this occasion. So we have an opportunity to really get our message across to key negotiators and decision makers at the COP meeting. Just a word about data strategy. So the UN Secretary General has implemented what we call the UN data strategy across the organization. And he's doing this because data is important to fuse and to make decisions about people and planet. And so we're now looking at the types of data that we would like to integrate, so we can make predictions concerning potential risks, so whether it's in crisis or it's in procurement or other areas, based on complex data. The use of dashboards in order to fuse this data into one environment and then to use that as a decision-making tool, and also to better forecast outcomes and identify opportunities. So this is an important step that the UN is making to really update the way that it's looking at data and using it, and increasingly using also data mining and artificial intelligence to do that. The roadmap for the implementation of this is quite a long roadmap, but we're at this design and foundation stage into the strategy and implementation stage. And we need to focus on increasing people's training within the UN, to focus on centers of excellence and partnerships also, including partnerships with the private sector companies like Google and IBM and others. And we've just recently developed a strategy for public-private engagement so that we can work with partners like Google and IBM to provide, for example, alerts for early warning. And we have things called CAP alerts, which are, again, protocols which are automatic alerts. So this is really something which is on the forefront of what we would like to achieve as part of the UN and using data. And information is important from the climate change domain, from the extreme weather area, from water also, and is increasingly used by decision makers to underpin their thought process and their actions. So we are a UN agency that is authoritative, and we maintain information which is based on facts and on the academic environment, and we don't try to politicize that data. So we're not a political organization, but we're really a scientific and technical organization. But our information is policy relevant and can be brought into the political arena by national governments or by United Nations Secretary General. You'll see here that we have also a set of sustainable development goals, and again, you'll see that they cover all areas. We have 17 goals, and we have targets that go up to 2030. One of which also is the data and innovation aspect. But all of these sustainable development goals are connected in some way. So, for example, goal 13, you can't achieve climate action without looking at, for example, the water goal or the oceans goal. And this also impacts on poverty, on clean water and sanitation, even on gender equality. So there's lots of interconnections between these goals. And there's quite a lot of aspirational targets. Now, at the moment, because of COVID and because of the impacts of climate change, we're not able to achieve some of the targets that we originally set out to from 2015 in the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is quite a concern to the member states and to the UN in general. So we need to make progress on a number of these. We have, for example, reduced poverty in overall, but now we see that COVID is impacting on that and actually bending the curve upwards. And then goal 17 about partnership is where we bring things together. So partnerships for implementation. So how do we develop partnerships with academia, with the UN, and also with the private sector for implementation of these goals. So I think that was all my slides, I just want to say finally just a few general comments before you'd like to ask me any questions. So I think in the area of crisis management and security, the climate change is impacting on in a combination of effects. So we have a nexus of different effects. We have climate change, which is a driver, but we have extreme weather related to climate change, which then also impacts on, for example, water and water availability, or, for example, water-related disasters like floods. Then we see an impact on on the population, so on either migration or economic impacts. And then we see sometimes then that we see the security risk going to more hard security, for example, terrorism-related security, especially in areas which are under water stress. And the COVID-19 impact is still to be determined really what impact that has on this overall picture, but we can say for sure that that it has had significant economic and societal impacts, and the combination of COVID-19 and climate really causes some concern at this stage, and we really need some political focus and investments. Now, the European Union during this Green Deal discussion about the financing has really focused also on not just on the COVID aspect and on, for example, health provision and sorting the crisis out, but also invested in climate action and on green technology and then, for example, the move to carbon neutrality across several European countries. So we're still hoping that we'll have a good outcome at the end of the year in the Glasgow meeting. But we're facing these challenges as we go through the year. So I hope that was useful just to give you an idea of what our agency is doing and what elements we take into account, both in climate and security and also risk management, and what we're doing as a UN agency to provide information to decision makers. So I think now there's enough time to ask any questions. Sonia, if anybody wants to pose questions, I'll be very happy to elaborate further. So I hope that was fine.
Thank you, Dr. Egerton, for this wonderful presentation and for the presentation of your work at the United Nations, both your personal work and your work as an agency and an organization overall. I agree with you that maybe the climate change is not one of the security risks today, but maybe the security risk today, that climate change has many faces today, and that probably the sustainable development goals are just the many faces of one solutions of how to make our world better and how to prevent all the disasters and security risks that are posed by not just the climate change, but by the all other risks such as poverty, water scarcity, and so on. Recently, I had the opportunity of listening a very interesting lecture by Dr. Dragan Savic on the problems of water and water security, and it was interesting how the water scarcity in Russia actually caused that smaller amount of food was exported from Russia to North Africa, just right in the time of the African Spring. And it's really what amazes me is how these little things that could happen, these little stones that can start rolling, what type of events and security risks they can start. And it is wonderful that the organization is doing this this early warning systems, that you have your satellites that provides you and all of us with data on current climate issues. It's applaudable that Europe has very well developed climate change tracking and a new Green Deal problem. But what actually worries me is what will happen with the developing countries, which are least equipped and which are most exposed to the climate change risks. So they're most exposed and they are most vulnerable. This is all for me, if you would have a time to answer my questions, but now I would like to give the floor to my dear colleague Lera from the regional board of our organization to start the discussions with our dear colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia. Respected Dr. Egerton, it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this lecture, this webinar. My name is Leta, and I'm one of the organizing members. I'm a PhD student from Skopje. I greet you from Skopje, North Macedonia. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to listen to this very important and serious issue, which targets both, let's say, first world countries and third world countries. I would firstly like to place space for the colleagues Emir and Josipa. They have raised hands to start a discussion or ask a question, and later, if there is time left, I would like to point out a concrete example of water terrorism, if I may make a word like that, an expression, a notion like that. So thank you once again. Josipa has raised her hand to ask you something. Here we go, Josipa.
Thank you, Leta. Good evening, everyone. And firstly, I would just say that I'm very grateful for this presentation and that we have Dr. Egerton tonight with us. And actually, my question is, of course, connected to this extreme weather and climate changes, because I think that is our biggest concern, because always if we don't have control of the things, then we are panicking and then it's our biggest scare. So my question is actually that we are all aware that still we have climate issues and climate problems in whole world. But my question is regarding how climate actions can be implemented on national level. So that means, of course, that every state is regulating their priorities, but I think that we are actually having this issue in many years. So, you know, like we are talking about climate changes for so long, and apparently at national levels, there isn't any maybe particular action to prevent and maybe to make things better. So my question is regarding that. Thank you.
Thanks. Shall I answer in sequence of the question? Is it easier like that?
Yes, you may, sir.
Okay, thanks. I'll start then. So thank you, Josipa, for that question. You're correct that, in fact, in order to be able to take action, national governments have to take on board this information and have a coordination. So we have something called national frameworks for climate services, which we've been trying to roll out across many countries. And European countries are relatively advanced in this, and we're still seeing some some lack of coordination in say, the LDCs, the least developed countries, and small island developing states. We need to have kind of a whole of government approach to this issue, because we see that there is significant economic damage and also social damage. And if we have a major storm, for example, it can paralyze communities. We have major flooding, which can cause millions or even sometimes billions of dollars of damage. And it takes a long time to recover, especially in countries which can't construct very fast. And then you have to keep populations outside of their housing or in temporary housing. And so normally we would have something like an emergency planning ministry that would be fed with information from, say, the National Meteorological Service. And that model works in several countries or in many countries, but we would need to have a coordination with different ministries. And so it's important to have a good flow of information so that they have good information for early warning. And then the government can use that information actionably to warn the population, and then to take mitigation measures or measures which are, in a post-disaster sense. So it means mobilization of emergency services. It means investment, emergency investment released, for example, for temporary housing or for restoring electricity. And you can see that this works quite well, for example, in the United States, where they can release, federal emergency funds. So the state would request the president to make a declaration of an emergency, and then the funds can be released to the state. But in some countries that don't have such a big, set of ministries or bureaucracies, then it's maybe much more difficult to do that, to be able to release funds immediately and to have, action on the ground. So the only way that we can do this is to at least share information about how it's done in certain countries, how ministries should coordinate, what information they can use, and what investments need to be made at that time, and to make it a high priority for the government. So in a lot of cases, the Prime Minister may chair a cabinet meeting which has emergency powers, and you have different ministers which are responsible for that. I know in the Balkan region, after major flooding, this also happened, I think, in Serbia and in other regions. So, but again, it's being able to have the capacity to then, if it occurs again on multiple times, then it has impacts, because you may have one disaster and then you may have something that's coming after that quite fast. And you may not be able to cope with multiple disasters, especially economically. We saw, recent earthquakes in Croatia around Zagreb, quite close together, and that had quite an impact on certain areas. We see for example, after the storm that hit Mozambique, Hurricane Idai, a lot of people were killed because they didn't get the message to move out fast enough, or they didn't want to move, because if they moved out of their houses, then somebody may take their possessions. So they decided to stay, but then they were inundated by the flood. And so it's getting the message to the population on the ground that they need to evacuate. We've seen that also in Bangladesh, where we've had storms impacting on Bangladesh, and we've been able to inform the population earlier so that they can evacuate, so there's less loss of life. But again, it's about better coordination amongst national ministries and having also policies to do that. So that, I think, hopefully covers your question.
Mr. Emir has also a question. Emir, you may start with your question.
Thank you. Firstly, I want to thank you for your presentation lecture. It was kind of eye-opening. So my question is, can extreme weather be strategically weaponized by governments or non-state actors to hurt someone or something? So can climate change be new age terrorism in these days? So that's my kind of question. Thank you.
Could you just elaborate a little bit more on it? What you mean by weaponizing? In what respect?
Can some governments use weather or climate change to how to say, can they artificially make some problems to cause problems in other countries like floods or extreme rain and stuff like that?
Yeah. No, not really. I think we see sometimes on the internet, stories which talk about weather manipulation and modification. The atmosphere is extremely, both the magnitude of the atmosphere is extremely large and also dynamic, and so it's not possible, apart from local, cloud seeding, for example. For example, in the Middle East, we see some countries which are producing some artificial rain for irrigation, but we're not able to harness the atmosphere on a large scale to cause any effect. It would take, massive amounts of energy, and this is something which is pretty much science fiction at the moment. So what isn't science fiction is there are some possibilities to potentially extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which there are some experiments that are trying to see whether there's some machines that can suck carbon dioxide from the atmosphere on a local scale in order to at least reduce greenhouse gases. But this is in the area of climate engineering, and we're at a very early stage in discussion about climate engineering. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change mentioned that it needs to be taken into account in the future. But you mentioned about this terrorist aspect or security aspect, and no, certainly not at all. And the only obviously impact is for terrorism is when we have water stress, for example, as you mentioned earlier on, where we may see a region like the Lake Chad Basin where we have a lot of impact on water stress, and then the population can then be held a little bit. If you have, for example, terrorist actors on the ground there, then they can start to regulate how much water people can receive, and so that results in migration. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Egerton, for your answers. I would like to ask the participants, is there anyone else interested in asking a question or some comment?
Dragana has a hand up, and Marco now. So
Yes,
Dragana was first, yeah.
Yes, good evening to everybody. First of all, I would like to thank you for a wonderful and interesting presentation, and I really was honored to listen to you today. As we have already seen, climate change has a major impact on farmers. They never know if there will be enough rain or maybe even too much. This is especially important for developing countries. So do you think that because of that situation, there is a risk that in the near future, there will be not enough food for everybody? So that will be my question, and thank you once again, Dr. Egerton.
Yeah, thank you, Dragana, for that good question. We do deal quite a lot with the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, and the World Food Programme. And what we've developed is a series of what's called regional climate outlook fora, which means that in a region, for example, in Africa, you have several countries that come together and analyze ahead of time, so several months ahead, what climate impacts there could be on agriculture and food security. And they seem to work quite well, so we have some good coordination on it. And we also have something called the Early Warning, Early Action Network, which FAO is coordinating. And in fact, they gave a briefing, I think today or tomorrow is going to be from the FAO office in Geneva. And this is really pulling together both climate issues and also the food security and the farmers' issues, the pastoral farmers' issues, to see where we can communicate to farmers on the ground that there could be, for example, a dry period or lack of water, which could affect their crops. And we try to do, we've set up a system also via mobile phones where they receive alerts on both extreme weather and also on longer term climate impacts. What we're seeing at the moment is that we're going through what's called a La Nina year last year, which is a slightly cooler year normally, or a cooling of the Pacific, and it has some impacts different places globally. Sometimes results in heavy rainfall and sometimes in drier periods. And then we have something called an El Nino, which is a warmer period in the Pacific Ocean, which also has impacts. So when we have a La Nina or an El Nino year, we tend to see a lot more impacts on regionally, where we could see impacts on food security. And sometimes, for example, you see heavy rainfall in parts of East Africa, which could result in flooding and then maybe damage to crops, or you may see longer periods of drought. But most of these can be forecast in advance, and therefore there's maybe less impact that we would go into a kind of unpredictable situation of drought or of loss of crops. So I think we, as a UN system, have enough information that we can brief governments on this, and so the risk is not so high, apart from if individual national governments don't take action, on these warnings. So it's important that they take action also based on the information that we have. I hope that answers your question, Dragan.
Yes, it is. Thank you once again.
Mr. Marco, the floor is yours to ask a question for Dr. Egerton.
Hello. Yes, thank you. Dr. Egerton, first I would like to thank you very much for the very interesting presentation and the depth of the insight that you gave us regarding the climate change and the part that and the success of it, what the UN is doing with it, and how we are able possibly to influence it to make a better world for us. Now, my question is more or less to the part, we are all seeing that the developing countries are having problems, but is there any way in which there is probably some way that the UN or other regional or sub-regional organizations do have any means of implementing, or better to say, forcing local governments in conducting and obliging some laws of environmental protection, or let's say redefining some climate protocols that, for instance, the trading of the expelled CO2 is no longer possible, so that we are making some concrete advancements towards at least slowing down the man-infested climate change. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marco, for that question. So a lot of that discussion takes place in two venues. One is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and we have many countries which are actually part of that process, and that's where they're discussing about what we'd call nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which basically commitments from the government to achieve certain targets within the Paris Agreement. And originally the NDCs were started in the Paris process, and now we were doing a review of the NDCs, and we're seeing some progress, but not enough progress. So we can't enforce anything in the UN because we can't, for example, enforce sanctions on environmental issues. So we can only enforce from the Security Council, sanctions generally on hard security issues. The other venue that we use is what we call the UN Environment Assembly, which is part of UNEP, UN Environment Programme. And this is where environment ministers from 193 member states meet to discuss about their environmental regulations. And in the European Union, we have very strict regulations on environmental and part of the European Union member states. And so that's quite well regulated. But in other parts of the world, we see also difficulties in being able to implement. And this is not something, again, we can strongly enforce, because a lot of the developing countries and small island developing states are suffering from climate change, but they're not necessarily the biggest emitters. So, the emitters are larger countries, maybe within the G20 type countries, but the impacts of climate change is being felt in developing countries and small island developing states. And so we've been discussing about financing mechanisms to assist those countries. And so one of the targets for the Paris Agreement is to commit $100 billion a year to climate action. And we've been able to reach part of that through the Green Climate Fund and those mechanisms, but we still haven't reached this target of 100 billion a year. It's quite a robust target that we need to look at within the context of the Paris Agreement. Financing is extremely important for adaptation also, because you can look at the mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gases and being carbon neutral, but you also need to invest in adaptation, because the effects of climate change will continue for many decades. So it means that even if you stop the emissions now, the inertia in the atmosphere, the change in the climate will continue, like a ship that is very slowly coming to a halt. So these large ships take a long time to stop, and they have inertia. So the atmosphere also has inertia, and it means that you have to then plan for many extreme weather impacts in the future, even if we make some decisions now to stop. So we may need to build dams, or we may need to build tidal barriers or other things to make sure that the population is not impacted. We've also been working on financing mechanisms for countries to improve their observation systems as well. So we know there are gaps, as I've said, and if you don't have basic observation systems in the country, you're not able to really monitor what's going on, and you need to be able to sustain them over a long period of time and to warn the population. So those are a few things that I'd like to say on your questions. I hope that's helpful. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Egerton, there is a question in the chat from Vladka. The question goes, good evening and thank you for this really interesting lecture. My question is concerned with the effect that COVID-19 has on climate change and vice versa. It seems to me that the problem of climate change has been a little bit ignored since the virus appeared. However, could it be that climate change may affect the further development of the virus? And thank you in advance from Vlad.
That's great. Thank you for that question again. It's very interesting. There obviously is a focus more on the pandemic, and because this is affecting people straight away in the lockdown. And we, as I showed in one of the slides, we had some kind of local reductions in emissions, during that time. So people were not using cars and they were not traveling. And so we start to see a little bit the pollution reducing in areas. But this was only a temporary effect. And in fact, it bounced back quite quickly, even though, we had full lockdowns in certain areas. And then as it started to open up again, you see things starting to go back to normal and then even increasing. There hasn't been, I think in terms of the European Union and the UN, in general, we've not forgot about climate action or climate change. We've tried to keep it quite high on the agenda. So at the moment, what we're talking about now is, the combination also of the two, in that there was a meeting yesterday that heads of state from Africa attended, and also many other heads of state like Macron and Merkel and others, about the COVID and climate emergency. And as I mentioned earlier on, that when we have extreme weather and climate change occurring, if we add on top of that the effect of the pandemic, it's quite a big set of problems that we have to deal with. And governments have to, first of all, decide where they're going to invest, we know that climate change will be very expensive over a long period of time. And the pandemic is kind of a shorter period, but it's still extremely expensive. So there has to be decisions made about where to invest. But for example, the European Union, just agreed on the Green Deal, which is several billions of dollars of funds from the European Union, which are going towards climate action, mitigation and adaptation. Also, even despite the COVID pandemic. So, and we're seeing some countries committing to climate neutrality, including, again, many countries around the world are committing to that. And we've got some positive signals also from the United States recently about that issue as well. So we're trying not to ignore it, and this WMO and the agencies of the UN are trying to keep it at a high level to make sure that it's addressed. And the UN Secretary General is committed to making this, is making it a top priority together with managing the pandemic. Now, you said about the further development, we don't have yet evidence to say that in a kind of warmer climate that the virus will mutate faster or other things. We've looked into this, and at the moment we don't see any specific relationship between, say, weather patterns and the way that the virus is being transmitted. It can be transmitted also under cold conditions or warm conditions. So we see it in all areas of the world. And so we're further looking into this with academic studies about if there's any further connection with climate weather and the transmission of the virus. But at the moment, we don't see that.
If I may, Dr. Egerton, I would make a retrospective of a certain case study, maybe from this point of view, about it's more anthropogenic measure made by hostile parties rather than a direct climate change influence. Particularly, it's about in the early 2000s, in 2001, in the Republic of North Macedonia, there was internal conflict. So the Lipkovo Dam was the vents were closed, and for several days the civilian population was lacking access to water, and this case made it to the Hague Tribunal. But because of lack of resources and institutional capacities, it never had a legal outcome in the international and the national courts. But I thought it's an interesting example how water can be weaponized, as one of the colleagues said, in terms of internal conflicts and terrorist activities. So maybe something in that direction, your remark.
Yeah, well, I'm an international civil servant diplomat, so I have to be a bit careful on commenting on any national issues specifically. So what I can say is that when you have extreme water stress or lack of water, then it can cause issues of security for the population. And so this, if there is, for example, there's been several areas where there's disputes about water security. So, for example, dams have been built in certain areas or around the world, and they may, because water is a transboundary issue, then you get a lot of discussion about who is owning that water or supplying that water, and so there may be some downstream effect on if one country, for example, decides not to to enable that water to flow into another country, then there is some maybe downstream security risks. And in major rivers of the world, that's been also an issue, and in other parts of the world. But water is an important commodity for sanitation, for health. We need water during the pandemic also. And so there is quite a discussion about water and security issues in general. So I think that's probably all I can say about that. I wouldn't want to comment on any specific cases, but in general, I can say that.
Thank you. We have a question. Just a second, excuse me. From Maria Živanović. Thank you for your great presentation. And what do you think about the role of nanotechnology in water treatment? And thanking in advance.
So I'm not an expert in this area, but again, I think that there are, for the water, for sanitation and cleansing, I think the use of nanotechnologies for purifying water and also making sure there's no pollutants or viruses within the water is important. So I think technology is it's really at the forefront of technology, and we don't deal a lot with. We're dealing more with the water cycle in WMO, but not specifically on the supply and on the sanitation part of it. But we do have a group called UN Water that has a set of agencies that are looking at all different types of water-related issues. And we have agencies like UNEP, UNICEF, particularly looking at water and sanitation for developing countries. We have agencies like UNESCO also that are dealing with the International Hydrological Program and technologies related to water. And there's several institutes that UNESCO host on this water and technology issues. So I think that's all I can say about that. I'm not an expert in the technology part of it.
Thank you for your answer. Just to check the chat. I would like to ask Professor Keković, which is present here, does he have something to add? Or
Thank
maybe...
you. Before me, I think Nevena Stanković would like to ask question. Nevena?
Thank you, Professor. First of all, I would like to greet Dr. Egerton and thank you very much for an extraordinary lecture and very interesting presentation. I'm sure that all of our participants enjoyed it as I did. And thank you once again for the opportunity to make it available to those members that weren't able to be with us tonight. So I would like to use the opportunity to ask two questions, if it's okay. First, what really impressed me in your presentation is the way that you and UN as a whole deal with these kind of situations from the perspective of crisis management. So beside the very important fact that you mentioned, that you are not a political organization, but a purely scientific organization. And beside the valid crisis communication, organizational culture, and similar, is there anything else that you would like to point out as the key for being such a resilient organization from the aspect of crisis management? And the second question, we know how important this topic is. And for example, we can see the annual reports of the World Economic Forum that this kind of threats that are environmental nature, that has an environmental nature to top 5. But is there anything that can create an effective and efficient response, not just whole government, but whole society response to this kind of threat? Thank you once again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Navina. It's nice to meet you, as we've been corresponding also beforehand, and congratulations also to you. I'd like to, I think for the crisis management part of it, yeah, I've mentioned about both the European Union and the UN, and we're increasingly working together also between the 2 emergency response centers that we have, and we're also developing a hub here in Geneva, which is with Meteo Swiss and with several other partners like the UN DRR, the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Agency. And what we're trying to do is to collaborate so that we have the best information flow. And we're a UN agency that focuses on scientific data and the most authoritative information. So we have to be clear that the information is trusted and that it's coming from a trusted source, and therefore then it's better used than in decision making. We've been trying to use this early warning systems to build resilience across our different member states, and especially in countries which are affected by hurricanes or cyclones. That this is one of the most regular threats that we have. We have it every year, North Atlantic hurricanes, and in fact last year was a very intense season, and we saw impacts, for example, on countries like Haiti. And Haiti has in any way sometimes problems internally with either disease or the pandemic has affected the society, or we have earthquakes. And then when you put on top of that extreme weather on a society which is affected by a number of other issues, which it puts quite a stress on that society, and therefore we really need to build both early warning and resilience to these extreme weather. And the importance of early warning systems, therefore, is and information to government is extremely important. We saw, for example, during COVID, when you're faced with a hurricane, normally you would move out of your house to a common shelter. And during the COVID pandemic, when people are not supposed to be together, and then you're placing them in a common area together, again, you raise the risk. So there's this kind of multiplicity of factors which we have to take into consideration at this time. I think for the World Economic Forum risk report, you see that, okay, it's based on the perception of a set of businesses and private sector that provide that information on what the global risks are. We start to see, as we've mentioned, about whole of government approach, but then you talk about whole of society approach. Now, the UN is the only body, I would say, that can elaborate a whole society approach. So the UN Secretary General is trying to reach out to the world and saying that these issues are extremely important and that need to be raised by the public and flagged up to politicians in different countries. So through the Sustainable Development Goals, we try to do that. We try also to use the presence that we have in different countries through the resident coordinator system, where UN has presence on the ground to also reach out to the population and say that they should be aware of these issues. In the end, I think the actions will take place because populations will put pressure on their governments in different countries to to adhere to the Paris Agreement or to those targets. And the more and more disasters that occur, the more and more economic damage or loss of life that will occur. And therefore there needs to be some solutions to that. So we're playing our part in trying to provide the best information, you know, for people to make decisions on for the future. So I hope that answers a bit your question. I don't know if it covers all of it, but I hope that that would be useful for you.
Thank you very much.
Sonia, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch your hand previously. You are free to ask a question if your hand is on purpose.
Thank you, Letta. So you've kind of inspired me by mentioning the United Nations Security Council. As a faculty student, I had the opportunity to mock debates and decision-making process in the UNSC, and that always inspired me to think, can the UNSC work better? And now I won't be talking about the veto options that some countries has, but I would like to ask you, what do you think? Is there a possibility that the UNSC applies a multidisciplinary perspective when they are discussing about security threats and security situations in affected countries? Because during our webinars, we have always put an emphasize on a multidisciplinary problem-solving methods. And the thing, I'm a lawyer by vocation, but actually with my college education taught me as the holistic approach is the best approach there is. So should there be a kind of a change of a paradigm in the UNSC while deciding upon some sanctions and security matters in the council? Should they think bigger? Should they change their perspective and maybe apply some other things, some other methods on the decision-making process, and not just fully concentrate on the conflict on the hard security and security threats, but maybe see that maybe because of the climate change in a certain region, a certain problem emerged? Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks, Sonia. It's a very good question. I think already there is starting to be change. And as I mentioned to you, on at least 2 or 3 occasions now, normally the members which are non-permanent members, so some of them, the rotating members, the 10 that are rotating, bring things to the table. And so when we were invited to address the Security Council, we were able to bring this topic on the table. And it was quite innovative, and I think there was a good debate on it. Some countries were against discussing about these issues. They want to just discuss hard security issues, and the council, they feel that the council should be used for that. But also there is increasingly, I think, a multidisciplinary approach to the information that they receive. So they receive briefings from different heads of UN agencies. So maybe the head of the Food Security Agency or my Secretary General or others, which adds to the debate, and it really adds, I think, in the end to the actions. Now, the issue of climate has been discussed in the context of things like the Lake Chad Basin and what's happening in this region, because in any way it's affected by hard security issues. And so, but it's carefully discussed. So the permanent members of the Security Council, some of them have a harder view than others. As I mentioned to you, UK presidency of the Security Council recently, and you can find this on the internet, they had a debate about climate and security, and they called some experts to give some impression of that. And they're also calling, say, youth members of the youth representatives to address the council as well on how they're affected, how their lives are affected by these issues. And so it's important to have different voices, the voice of science, the voice of youth, political side and see it in different angles. And I think there has been some discussion about how the Security Council should open up to more to these issues. And sometimes they have what's called ARIA formula meetings, which are a non-formal, so they don't have them in the chamber of the Security Council, but they have them, say, in another meeting room, and they invite a broader selection of people to listen to those debates. And so there is some movement in that. The only thing is that we can't, at this stage, they've not imposed any sanctions or anything which is related to Security Council resolutions on this issue at the moment. So it remains still at the level of more information exchange. And I know that the UN Secretary General is committed to working with the Security Council members to, reform of the body. That's an ongoing thing at the moment. But we were able to participate several times, in the discussions. And while I was in New York, UN agencies were able to go into the room also as observers as well and listen, even sometimes if they were not called, to speak. But we could actually follow the business there as well.
Thank you very much.
Dragana, sorry to keep you waiting. You have your hand raised.
No, that is for first.
Sorry. Okay.
Professor Kekovic, would you like to conclude this debate and give some of your own points of view?
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Mr. Egerton, very much for your excellent presentation. It is a fantastic session, really a lot of questions from our young colleagues for you. And when it comes to security aspects of climate change, do you see, how do you see relationships between climate change issues and United States and Chinese relationships and competition in achieving global leadership, and vice versa? How climate change affects the relationships, please?
Okay, so I have to be careful here again. You're asking some controversial questions, but I think in general these two powers, obviously they're global superpowers, and we saw a certain policy from the previous US administration, which appears to be changing now, and we see a lot more announcements about support to climate action. I think President Biden is going to be hosting this summit in a few weeks, in a couple of weeks' time on the Earth Day, inviting other world leaders, including Russia and China, to participate. I think one of the things is about carbon neutrality, and can the big emitters of the G20 set targets on trying to go carbon neutral, and also targets on the emissions, because in general the global emissions won't change unless we have a number of the G20 countries committing to these targets. There's differences in I think that both the US and China are investing in green technology. The US has been investing in solar and also natural gas, and also China has been quite a leader in solar as well, and WMO has been working with a company called Guideco, or it's an organization called Guideco, which is a electricity grid company, but is focusing on renewable energy, and has lots of plans around the world to try to, especially across Africa, to invest in green technology for electricity supply and transmission. So there are a lot of things happening in both superpowers on this, but there are obviously also disagreements as well. And so we'll see in the COP26 process, as we go up to Glasgow at the end of the year, what the position will be from those two countries. And we're expecting to see we saw the US rejoining the Paris Agreement, and China is part of the existing Paris Agreement, but then negotiators will define their national determined contributions and their commitments at the end of the year. And then we see other countries around the world that that need to also take some actions. And the bloc, I think the European Union bloc of countries has generally made very good progress in carbon neutrality and commitments. And so we see again this bloc which has also high emitting countries which have committed to reaching targets from the European Union. So Commissioner van der Leyen has announced these recently, and we've seen quite a big investment in the new Green Deal. So we see positive signals coming from around the world at the moment that the Glasgow meeting at the end of the year could be quite successful. But we do need to have that success, because if we don't make progress, then we're going to be really in a bad situation. So we do need to see really progress in these negotiations. And COVID has impacted on that, because they're not able to have a lot of physical negotiations. So you can't sit around the table and negotiate very easily now. And you can't have meetings together to discuss about certain issues. So a lot of it's on video conference. And so even this diplomacy on climate has been affected by the COVID pandemic. And we're now having to do digital diplomacy at the moment, via Zoom meetings, where normally you would take somebody into the room and discuss with them to sort out some issues and then come back into the negotiating room. But it's difficult at the moment to do that. So.
Thank you very much. There are a lot of cross-cutting issues, and you mentioned a lot of them. Thank you for that, and thank you very much for your reply. And I would like to thank to you for your excellent presentation once again. And you are invited to stay in touch with us and to continue with sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you to our audience, and thanks to all for your questions and patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hvala. Dobro večer. Thank you very much for your invitation.
I laku noć.
Laku noć also.
Laku noć in Croatian and Serbian as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hvala. Thank you very much.
Hvala.
Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you all.